Hey guys, DJ here at Top Tech Cards and Games, and in this video I'm going to talk about Esper Dragons. It's a blue-black-white control deck that uses the dragon cards to close the game out and get some sweet value out of some of the dragon spells from Dragons of Tarkir. The first of our dragons are 4 Dragon Lord Ojutai. Ojutai is really the backbone of the deck. He can swing in, find you more cards. He has hexproof, so you can keep him back to block. He has a very solid clock. It's a turn 4 clock. And he gives the deck a lot of game against mid-range decks and even aggro decks in some ways, because you can actually close the game out fairly quickly and not give them enough time to find all their reach. He's one of the main reasons this deck is different from another control deck, though, like a generic blue-black control deck playing like Perilous Vaults and stuff that just wants to grind the game out indefinitely. Because we have a card like Ojutai that we want to stick and play, we can't really play that game. We can't sit there and vault our opponent's board, for instance, because we want to keep our dragon in play and we want to keep finding more cards with it by attacking. So it makes this deck a little bit different, a little more proactive than other control decks, but it also gives it another dimension, because if you're playing against a faster deck and they stumble, you can play an Ojutai and suddenly they're on the back foot. You have a 4-turn clock when he's in play. When he's untapped, they can't deal with him, so the turn you play him, your opponent's not able to really play a kill spell on him, and then you can try to find counter magic to keep him protected. We do have some other dragons in our deck. We have 2 other ones, 1 copy of Dragon Lord Silumgar and 1 copy of Silumgar Drifting Death. These cards are good in different matchups, and I mean, you could play 2 of 1 or just play 1 of them and play a different threat. Dragon Lord is very good against grindy mid-range decks, and even okay against kind of slower aggressive decks. To just take one of their threats, it's got a 3/5 body with Death Touch, so it's very hard for them to swing into. It doesn't really die to most kill spells, like they would have to play a Downfall on it or something. And just stealing like a Siege Runner or something can really take over the game if your opponent doesn't have a lot of removal for it. And then Drifting Death is interesting because he can create a lot of interesting tricks with Bow Blight. For instance, if your opponent has like a regular Fleeceman line and a monstrous Fleeceman line, you can swing in with Drifting Death. They both get the -1. Bow Blight the other, or the non-monstrous one, both are dead. Or your opponent has Dragon Lord Ojutai, so do you. You swing in, downgrade their Ojutai, Bow Blight your own, theirs is dead. So it can get a lot of interesting tricks. Those aren't real reasons to play the card, but I felt like they were worth mentioning. It also has hexproof, which makes it hard to deal with for grindier control decks. If they want to use a Wrath to kill my Drifting Death, so be it. Depending on your meta, you might want to switch one of these guys to an Ashiok if you have a lot of control decks. But our metagame is very light on control, so we're not playing an Ashiok. Then our last threat is Ugin. He's kind of a dragon. He's recurable with Haven of the Spirit Dragon, which is a very relevant ability. But Ugin just takes over games against mid-range decks, and especially against decks with Deathmist Raptor. If they've set up a board with multiple Deathmist and you just get to remove them all, that can really help you go over the top. Because that's one of the main pieces of staying power those decks have against you, the Den Protector Deathmist decks. Like, if you can get rid of the Deathmist, so they're relying on Den Protector for recursion to really grind the game out, you're very, very far ahead. Next we have draw spells. We have 4 dig through times. We're playing, fetch lands, kill spells. This card's going to end up being fairly cheap fairly quickly. But even if you have to play it for like 5-6 mana later in the game when you don't have a threat, this card will find you what you need. Like, you can play dig, find Dragon Lord plus Silumgar Scorn, and then, you cast Dragon Lord turn 7 with Silumgar Scorn backup. So it can really just help you take over games. The next card is our other draw spell, and it's the weakest card in the deck. We have 2 copies of Anticipate. I'd really like to cut Anticipate. I've thought about subtracting the 2 Anticipates and adding in another land, and then maybe another threat or another kill spell, or just various things. Maybe another counter spell, maybe something with Scry, so we can still make sure we find our cards that we need. But for right now, there's 2 copies in here. It's pretty good turn 2, so you can do something when you've left up removal and your opponent didn't play anything you need to kill or didn't play anything you needed to counter. Then we have our Disruption Suite. We have 4 Silumgar Scorn. For 2 mana, it's a Force Spike sometimes, and it's a counter spell some other times. The Force Spike mode is pretty good early in the game when you're playing against mid-range decks. Like, either they choose to slow down and play more into your game, playing their cards a turn late, or they just jam them because if you have a dragon in your grip, then it's just a counterspell anyway. So either way, it's pretty good. If you've played Syncopate, you know how good Force Spike or a counter unless they pay 1 can be. That's how that card works out a lot of times. Your opponent taps out to play a spell and it just counters it. And later in the game, when they have the extra mana, ideally you will have an Ojutai in play even. So you're just countering spells for 2 mana, which is obviously a very good card. Counterspell still sees play all the way into Legacy. Then we have 2 Dissolve, sorry. cancel variants, right? Dissolve is just counter a spell, scry card. 1 mana extra to scry isn't the greatest deal, but scry is pretty good in this deck, and we wanted more counter magic. Then our last piece of disruption is 3 Thoughtseize. You can play less Thoughtseize if your meta was heavily aggro based. If you have a lot of the Death Dealer, Abzan aggro, and Mono Red aggro in your meta, you could cut a copy, play 2, because the Lifeless is relevant. But in a more mid-range or control-based format, meta rather, you definitely want to play 3 copies of Thoughtseize. It's just such a good card. I don't think I can say anything about it that hasn't already been said. Moving on to the removal suite, we have a 3 mana, 4 copies of Hero's Downfall, and 2 copies of Foul Tongue Invocation. This is another swap you can make depending on what your meta looks like. I'm sorry, I'm putting my cards awfully low. If you have a lot of more aggressive decks, or decks with reach, or decks that play hexproof cards like Dragon Mirrors, for instance, you can play an extra copy of Foul Tongue over one of these Hero's Downfalls because the Foul Tongue for the aggressive decks offers life gain, and the difference between hitting their Zurgo Bellstriker or whatever, or their Monastery Swiftspear isn't the biggest. Like, yes, it's relevant, but gaining 4 life is more relevant, so you don't lose that much by losing the target ability. And the ability to make your opponent sacrifice an Ojutai or a Drifting deck is very, very good. Now, if you're in a metagame with a lot of Elspeth decks, a lot of Ugins, then Hero's Downfall is better. So you have to know your own meta to make the choice there, but I think the 6 3-mana kill spells is the correct number, and you choose to split them however you want. You can move a Downfall over to Foul Tongue or keep them at 4-2. Then we have our cheaper kill spells. We have 1 Ultimate Price and 2 Bobblights. These numbers are also perfectly movable. I've played 3 Bobblight, I've played 2-1. I've never played 3 Ultimate Price, and I don't think I would go that route. This card, Killing Fleeceman Line, is too relevant in Death Dealer, so I wanted to keep 2 copies of it and then play 1 Ultimate Price. Ultimate Price is pretty sick, though. Like, maybe 4 2-mana kill spells is even right, depending on your metagame. Definitely depending on your metagame. If there's a more aggressive meta, you could anticipate for another price. Because this card is much easier to cast turn 2 than Bobblight. So keep that in mind. Like, that's one of the hardest things with this deck. Your turn 2 mana requirements, like, you want to be able to keep up either blue-blue or black-black. So, and that's not bad when you lead with a turn 1 blue-black lane and then you have your choice turn 2. But it is nice to be able to leave up Silumgar Scorn and Ultimate Price. So if you're in a more aggressive meta, I already mentioned Shaving and Anticipate, or both Anticipates even, you could definitely put in another Ultimate Price. I like this split the most, though, just because there's so many different threats and the mana requirements do make Ultimate Price almost feel necessary. It's also important to play these cards over all 3 mana kill spells so that on like turn 5, for instance, you can leave up a 3 mana spell and a 2 mana spell. Then our last spells are 2 Crux of Fate. It's our Wrath variant, but it's got an interesting dimension in this deck because we have dragons as our threats. We can leave an Ojutai in play, our opponent does their thing, and then we kill all non-dragons. Now we have an Ojutai on a clear board, swinging in, finding us more cards. Maybe we do this on turn 7, so like we clear the board, swing with Ojutai, keep up Silumgar Scorn. That's very hard to come back with, and like I said, it's one of the main things that makes this deck better than other control decks where it takes such big advantage of your opponent stumbling, and it plays such a proactive game. Moving on to the lands, we have 4 Temple of Enlightenment. Blue-white land, you need white mana just to cast Ojutai. So there are a couple other white lands, but we'll get to that in a second. Then we have our blue-black lands. Like I said, you really want to start the game out with a blue-black land. So we have 4 Temple of Deceit and 4 Dismal Backwater. There's 8 Scry lands. I've thought about, when I cut Anticipates, maybe playing 1 black-white Scry, just so we can still, we'll have the extra land and we'll have the ability to look for our business spells. But black-white's not the most desirable mana combination. We do play 2 Caves of Koilos that produce that combination already. Honestly, if a Darkar Waste was printed, we would play that Pain land instead, but we just need more white sources to cast Ojutai. So we have 2 copies of Caves. Then we have 2 Haven of the Spirit Dragon. Haven is really sick. It just gives you such a good long game, too, if your opponent forces you into that role. Being able to sacrifice it to recur Ugins and Ojutais and even the Silumgar variants is just so good in a long game, and keeping a dragon in your hand for your counterspells. I really do think the neatest thing about it, though, is being able to recur Ugin. So if you play it, kill a board or something and they downfall it, just being able to get another Ugin is so good. For a while, a lot of people weren't playing Ugin, and I never really felt that was correct. The metagame might have dictated it. When the meta is heavily red-based, like red aggro, or Even against really slow control decks, Ugin's not great because you play him, you burn them for 3, and he gets downfalled. But when there's Abzan decks in the metagame, mid-range decks especially, like I think this card is just such a big reason to play Ugin, and Ugin is such a big trump against those decks. Then we have Urborg. Urborg is really relevant because it lets these cards, our fetches, not cost us life, which can be very relevant against more aggressive decks. And I don't really want to trade that ability. I've considered playing another Urborg a couple times also, because then we'd be able to get our double black easier while still, playing blue lands to keep our counter spells live, but we'd be able to drop Urborg and then all our black spells are live as well. But we have 5 fetches, 4 deltas, and 1 copy of Flooded Strand. And it's a bit awkward. Urborg's also really important because it lets us keep those lands live after we found all our basics, because we only play 5 basics. We have 3 copies of Island, 2 copies of Swamp. These aren't, bad numbers or anything. We definitely want more dual lands than these. Polluted Delta is fine, and then 1 extra Flooded Strand to find Island, but also Fuel Dig Through Time is great. But with Urborg, even if we've already found all our lands, it's very late in the game, these will still tap for black. And in standard format with really no land destruction, this is only really relevant super late into the game, so that's enough to get that there. Moving on to the sideboard, we have 3 copies of Drowning Sorrow, which is great against the aggro deck, specifically against mono red, and I played against a mono black aggro deck recently that it was very good against. 2 copies of Tassiger. Tassiger is also very good against mono red, surprisingly. You can play him very early as a 4/5 that blocks. It's really good in the control mirror because it gives you more threats, and another way to recoup cards. And honestly, it's just good against a lot of things. It's one of those cards that's never, an insane card, but it's always a good card. So, in a lot of matchups, you can find something to shave to bring in Tassiger, because it's just better than those other cards. Against slower decks, there's 2 copies of Dragonlord's Prerogative. It's very important to go over the top of your opponent. You always want to be playing a slightly slower game plan when you're playing, control or mid-range mirrors, or matchup rather. So your opponent's playing, Siege Rhinos and stuff. You're answering their cards, then they've kind of hit their ceiling, and then you draw 4 cards. Then we have 2 copies of Bobblight. Bobblight's great against the aggro decks. Always is. It's especially great against tokens. That's the reason we're packing the full set of those between our 75 and only 2 ultimate price. Ultimate price is much easier to cast against mono red though, so that's something to keep in mind. Then we have 1 copy of Silence the Believers. Silence the Believers is, I bring it in against a lot of aggro decks as well. It's also really good against Death Mist Raptor decks, removing them, and various other things like enchantment decks and whatnot. Then we have 1 copy of Foul Tongue. This might not be necessary. I might have way too much removal. In fact, I almost definitely have way too much removal. But I wanted the extra Foul Tongue in my 75 somewhere for dealing with opposing Ojitais and Drifting Deaths. So perhaps maybe I should fit that into the main board. I don't know. Then we have 1 Stratus Dancer. Stratus Dancer is another card that's good against a lot of things. It's a fine card in the mirror, countering their draw spells, their kill spells, whatever. It's good against mono red, countering a burn spell while making a blocker that'll trade with a creature. Then we have our 4 Thoughtseize for the control matchups, and 1 Perilous Vault. I just commented earlier about how I didn't really think Perilous Vault was great in this deck because you really want to keep Ojitais up. You could change this to an Utter End and try it. I did that, but it was hard on the white mana. I thought that was a lot better when I was playing a 1 of Temple of Silence for a 28th land. But this card is in here, and so is Utter End, for one thing only, really, just to deal with Mastery of the Unseen. That card can actually be very backbreaking for us, our opponent able to just put a creature into play every turn that could be something relevant. It becomes very hard very quickly, and your game plan really becomes race them with Ojitai, which isn't always a winning situation when they're flipping over Whisperwood Elementals and stuff like that with it. So I chose to play a copy of Perilous Vault to deal with it. This might not be correct. Maybe the Utter End was right. Maybe I just deal with it being hard to cast. Maybe I just don't worry about Mastery of the Unseen. Maybe I play another counterspell for it. There's a lot of options, but I chose to play 1 Perilous Vault and try it. It's been okay. I wish I could play the matchups more often, actually have it played against a ton of Mastery of the Unseen, but when I did, it was just a very hard card to deal with, so I chose to play something to deal with it. There's the deck list. There's a lot of things you can change, really. Well, I say that, but it's mostly numbers tweaking. You're not going to change the core of the deck. You're not going to stop playing Ojitai. You're not going to stop playing Dragons. You're not going to stop playing Silumgar Scorn or the removal spells. You have a lot of numbers you can tweak, especially the ultimate price ratio, playing Anticipate or not, the 3-mana kill spell ratios, what win conditions you choose to play after Ojitai. I do think 4 Ojitai is correct. I've seen some people play 3, and I just think that's dead wrong. I've seen some people play Icefall Regent because he's much better against the aggro decks than like Dragonlord Silumgar coming in, tapping something down, forcing them to use a lot of mana to remove him. But for the most part, I think this deck's pretty standard. It's a deck if you've been playing Standard this whole season, you're very familiar with, but it's a deck I like a lot. I wanted to do a video on it, talk about my choices a little bit, and maybe get some discussion going. If you guys have anything to say about the deck, any matchups you want to talk about, any sweet tech ideas you want to put forward, let me know down below in the comments. I'd be more than happy to read them, talk about your guys' ideas, and maybe share some more of mine if I have any new tech I want to talk about too. So, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you like this. If you're interested in watching the deck get played, we can try to put some play videos together too, get some people to play games. And thanks a ton for watching.